Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Cybersecurity Weekly. I'm your host, Fred Cobb, Executive Vice President and CISO at InfoSystems. With me today, Senior Security Consultant, Mr. Garrett Boyd. Garrett, welcome back to the show. Thank you for coming back yet again for another exciting episode.
Glad to be here, Fred.
Yeah, today we are wrapping up our series. It's been a lengthy series, but a very informative series, we do believe, on the Center for Internet Security, Critical Security Controls. We're up to number 20, which there should be some pomp and circumstance happening right now since we reached the end of that. But this is a very important topic to wrap up that series of controls. It involves penetration testing or pen testing. You know, that's a huge subject. We could talk a long time about it. Go into deep dive technical discussions about various tools and what have you. But for today, let's just hit some of the important points. What is it? Who needs it? Is it necessary? What are some approaches? So Garrett, I'll throw it back to you here just for a moment. When you think about pen testing and why organizations need it, or describe it a little bit, what comes to mind for you?
Well, first off, what comes to mind is the ability for a company to test out the security measures they have in place, right? So you have a firewall, you have your antivirus, you have all your SIMs in place, and you really want to see if they're working. So that's why you'd get something like a red team exercise or a pen test going to see how your security measures stack up against, certain real scenarios that threat actors would perform against your network.
Certainly. If you think about, is pen testing, if you had to divide, security services, security offerings, what are you doing for protection versus testing into an offensive strategy versus a defensive strategy? Pen testing is certainly one of those offensive things that we do. We put on, the cloak of a hacker, or we think of ourselves as kind of, funny, but it makes sense. Maybe like a pirate. We're trying to figure out, what we can pillage and plunder on a particular network. So talk a little bit about maybe some of the different types, whether it be internal or different types of pen testing that you might want to do for your organization.
Sure. Just as you said, Fred, you got internal scans or internal vulnerability assessments and pen tests, and you also have external vulnerability assessments and pen tests. External is going to be your web-facing IP addresses, and internal definitely is going to be your internal network. So anything within that internal subnet.
Sure. So if you think about just taking an external pen test, as you mentioned, anything that's public facing, such as a website or maybe a VPN concentrator, something that has a public facing IP, in terms of exposure, it doesn't get much worse than that. If it is a public IP that's on your network that could be bombarded with different types of attacks, and pen testing is trying to simulate those attacks. You mentioned a moment ago internal. So people are thinking, well, why should I do an internal pen test? Well, think about the pivoting aspects of an attacker. Let's say they gain access and get through the veil of the firewall, and they're sitting on the network. So what could they do? What could they pivot to? What systems could they get to for maybe a launch pad? Once inside that internal network. So another thing, if you wouldn't mind mentioning, think about zero knowledge versus maybe known knowledge about the environment. Could you speak to that just for a moment?
Yeah, so certainly based off, the scope that's provided to the red team, you'll go in there with a kind of a no knowledge assessment, or sometimes there's a limited knowledge, and sometimes there's a full blown, all about the network. So based on, I guess, how much information you want to give to the red team and really challenge them, you can provide that type of, not internal, but initial scope for the project.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned red teaming a couple times. I want to make sure we differentiate. There are some subtle differences between that. When you think of about a pen tester, it's sort of that, let me get some open source intelligence. Let me figure out what's going on through some recon. Let me do some basic scanning against the environment. There's a variety of tools out there that you can use to scan the environment. So let's say through scanning, I find that vulnerability. So let me see if I can use that vulnerability, in other words, exploit that vulnerability, perhaps gain access into the internal network. So let's say I'm successful in doing that. From there, I want to see if I can maintain a persistence within that network. So, and then from there, I can, go about harvesting credentials, collecting data, data exfiltration, all those nasty things that, a true attacker might be doing. That pen tester would simulate that. Whereas, in the case of a red team, they're usually targeted. I think you'll agree. They're usually targeting data that's perhaps sitting there that's a digital asset of a more mature company. A company, maybe they've already, for several iterations, they've had regular pen tests, but they want to take that to the next level. So, red teaming being more maybe refined in what they're going after target wise, maybe over a longer period of time. You may be pen testing an environment for 2 or 3 days or a week, but in case of red teaming, it could go on for several weeks.
Good point.
So that's a huge difference, much more specialized. But again, they're both in that pen testing family.
We'll be back with the Cybersecurity Weekly podcast after we pause for this special message. Security analysts believe cyber attacks will continue to escalate throughout 2020 and are recommending that every company, regardless of industry or size, place immediate focus on cybersecurity training and the tools that will protect you from these attacks. Did you know that you can book a cybersecurity assessment right now with Fred Cobb's team of cybersecurity engineers at InfoSystems? They will help you discover exactly where you are most vulnerable to a cyber attack and make recommendations on how to strengthen your defense in those areas. This is urgent. It's an issue that affects everyone in our community. Visit the InfoSystems website at www.infosystems.biz to request your cybersecurity assessment. Now back to the podcast.
There's a variety of tools out there. Garrett, is it something you have to always buy if you're going to be a pen tester, or there's some tools out there you can just find, open source, that kind of thing?
Sure. Most of the tools are open source, right? Nmap, a lot of stuff in Kali Linux. So there's a lot of open source tools you can use. Of course, Nessus is one of the tools that we could use, and use several others. But I guess the important thing to mention is a lot of things are open source and free to the threat actors. So
yeah, that's true.
Gain those.
Yeah, didn't mean to cut you off there, but yeah, if you can download it, certainly an attacker can find it, download it, and perhaps use that in the concentrated attack against you. So we've talked about, I guess, some of the elements making up the pen test, or some of the different types of pen tests. But who really needs it? If you think about, the average network out there, regardless, let's say you're a retail shop versus a healthcare entity versus a manufacturing facility, are there use cases for pen testing regardless of those types of environments?
You talking about outside of those environments?
No, I'm talking about would those environments have to think about, getting, or should they be thinking about getting a pen test?
Sure. I believe in some compliance standards through all those, whether it be NERC, PCI, HIPAA. A lot of those regular, semi-annual, or annual pen tests are required to be completed. So.
Right, you're absolutely right. Depending on your merchant level in the payment card industry framework, the PCI data security standard, there are requirements for pen testing. And if you're a service provider, you have to be pen tested more frequently. There's also segmentation type pen testing where you may be claiming at a particular area that's containing sensitive data has true isolation from the rest of the network. So you would do a specific pen test just to prove isolation or segmentation in some cases. You mentioned NERC, HIPAA. It absolutely should be part of your vulnerability management program. There are some gray areas, in the HIPAA security rule. It says, you need to maintain a vulnerability management program. But what does that mean? Some people, it means more than others. So it's not a mandate. There's nothing in the security rule for HIPAA that says you must have a pen test. But you're dealing with sensitive data, protected health information. Why not go that extra mile and make that part of your vulnerability management program?
Certainly, I think as business owners or clients, we all have an obligation to our customers in order to do that type of testing against ourselves. I believe for a peace of mind, why not go out and do or have a red team exercise or a pen test done against your environment? You have all the security controls in place, whether it be the firewall, the SIM. It's time to test it, right? Put it, let's see what it's really got. So, they are a little costly, a little expensive to do some pen tests and red team exercises, but are they worth it? Of course they are. I mean, you really want to test your equipment, test what you got.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we put all these layers of defense in place, and we assume, or we want to believe, that they're configured properly, that they're doing their job, they're protecting us from, the attackers out there. It is a good idea to, contract a company to be that offensive part of your security program and say, hey, you got these checks and balances in place from a defensive perspective. Let me see if I can circumvent them in any way. And if I'm successful in circumventing them, then you know what to shore up, how to make corrections in the configuration to make sure that the next time I'm not as successful in trying to attack you and get information from you. Another topic around pen testing I want to cover before we leave this particular subject is think about pen testing beyond, using a burp suite or using the Kali or, doing the vulnerability scans with Nessus in advance of doing the pen test. What are some other, considerations out there for offensive type maneuvers that would be considered really a type of pen test?
Well, sure. Something that comes to mind right off the top of my head is the application testing, web application pen testing, things like Acunetics or NetSparker that can do those type of vulnerability and pen test against your web applications.
Yeah, so you're moving it from a layer 3 type test with maybe a burp suite or a Kali to a layer 7 type test. I'm referencing the OSI model. You're looking at, as my website. We talked about this in the previous discussion, you and I, about the OWASP top 10 and looking for code faults, things that could lead to cross-site scripting, SQL injection. So using an Acunetics tool for layer 7 pen testing or something like Acunetics is definitely testing that, that web application part of your business. I was thinking about another one too. When we talk about pen testing, don't forget social engineering is a big part of pen testing. You want to elaborate on that for a moment?
Certainly. You're kind of pen testing your people. How will they respond to certain injections from a trained professional, I guess? Will they answer those sensitive questions? Will they give out that data that is not supposed to be given out? So certainly that's a pen test, and it's really a pen test against the people portion of it. Another type of pen test to mention is the physical security aspect, right? So, I mean, do you have your cameras in the right spots? Are your employees allowing tailgating, to circumvent your access control systems? Do you have, cameras in your server room like you're supposed to? So, or on, at the door, at the perimeter. So all those things definitely need to be checked. And that, I believe the physical security is certain that a thing that's often overlooked when it talks about pen testing, but probably shouldn't be.
Yeah, from a physical security, that type of pen testing or social engineering, I got some adventurous stories I could share about, just doing that and being challenged by particular clients where, hey, there's no way you can break our physical security, or, walking up, maybe you're walking up in a hospital environment to a nurse's station, you're starting to ask them questions. Hey, I'm from IT. We're doing a survey on password complexity. What's your, just taking a poll, what's your password? Just walking up, being friendly. Again, that's a social engineering exercise, but it's also a pen testing exercise because, to your point exactly, you mentioned testing the human. That's an important part of penetration testing. It's not always about just testing the network, testing your firewall or testing your IDS or testing your IPS. It's also testing that human element. We can put the wrapper on this one. I just would like to encourage everybody out there that's thinking about, do I need a pen test or not? pay attention to those compliance drivers that you and I both talked about. If you have a PCI compliance driver, make sure you're adhering to what you're supposed to be doing there. If you have a situation, your healthcare entity, really think seriously about doing a pen test to make sure that your protected health information is as safe and secure as you think it is. And also for those industrial environments, we haven't mentioned, programmable logic controllers or PLCs or SCADA yet on this podcast, but it's worth mentioning that, those environments are a little trickier, and particularly in production to pen test, because there is that fear of tipping over or causing, a service outage when conducting pen tests if you're not doing things carefully. In those type of situations, and others as well, sometimes it's not prudent to necessarily test production, but if you have a dev environment or you have a test environment that mimics, in totality your production environment, you can get really good data out of pen testing those test or non-prod environments. So would encourage, some thought around that for those of you out there in the community listening that are maybe worried about testing production in any way. If you have the capability to set up a test environment, by all means, set that up and test against that. So Garrett, any final thoughts before we wrap up this topic?
No, none here, but thanks, Fred.
Okay, well, again, it's been really an exciting process to step through these CSC controls with everybody, all the listeners out there. And we hope that you've got some good information out of our podcast series on the CSC 20. It's been really fun delivering it and talking about all these good topics. From this, we hope the listeners out there are taking some of this and are applying it into their real world environments, just pieces and parts, that make sense to you. We've had a great time doing it. Stay tuned for more cybersecurity podcasts coming up shortly. We're looking at different topics and looking at things that are happening in the news and some very exciting topics outside of the CSC 20 controls that we've been doing. So we'll be bringing that to you very shortly. And again, thank you for your patronage, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.